Thank you. So today my talk focuses on mostly on the resources in the British Library for the study of Ethiopian Middle Ages, as discussed by my two colleagues. The British Library's collection of Ethiopian manuscripts forms what's called a part of the Foundation collection. And these three main collections are the first that was donated to the library by Lord Harley, and the second was what was presented by the Church Missionary Society, around about 74 manuscripts. And the third largest collection is that of the Magdala collection, which was the result of the 1868 Abyssinian expedition, which was one of the greatest loots. So in the past couple of years now at the British Library, we've been sort of active in trying to digitize and create an online platform for our early manuscripts considered important or fragile. Unfortunately, the Ethiopian manuscript was the first to be digitized. When the selection was made, I focused on trying to get the early manuscripts on the platform to be digitized. And so in this brief talk, what I'm going to do is just share with you guys the resources out there, which in my opinion is always overlooked. The first example here is the Act of the Martyrs, which dates to the 13th century. And we have a colophon here of the king Agbazion. There's two ways of pronouncing his name, which is pretty much interesting material to survive from that period. He's the son of Yekuna Amlak. And we get this, the resources tell you a lot more once you start reading the text. The fact that the colophon at the end says the entire book of Mbakum Hababuk was written in the period of Egbazion. And it's interesting that they would choose that text. So things don't happen for no reasons. There's always a political motivation. And the first chapter of Mbako is really political. It's a criticism. And the other, obviously, important aspect of the collection is devotional books, dating as early as the 14th century. And they're pretty much important example of the book, of an individual book. So it was really from that, even before then, that we have books produced for individuals. And this Psalter, which came into the library in 1840 as part of the Church Mission donation, has that personal encounter with the notes and the marginalia at the top. Of course, the other important aspect is also the illuminating the text. And here we have a very beautiful example from the Magdala collection, the Octitude, which has been beautifully decorated. Again, here we, like the first manuscript I've just showed you, we see earlier on there is the tradition of patronage, of producing manuscripts. And this sort of continues. So the production of manuscripts is really taking place really early, from earlier on, which we see later on. And again, the examples here that I'm showing you with the harak here, with the design, it sometimes for me is an indication that this is possibly an early tradition that continued right down. And of course, there are a number of manuscripts with beautiful illustration here for art historians and people interested in that period, for that period to look at. And so one of the earliest Illuminated Gospel we have in the British Library is this 15th century, the four Gospels. Here in the opening shows St. Mark. And again, if one looks at the painting, you see the typical scroll and ink pot. So the resources out there are incredibly rich. And the other important example is this work of Gbarra Hech, which was actually commissioned by um, the abbot of the monastery of Derillo, and it's beautifully illustrated, as well as there are um, marginalia in there, for example, where one particular priest was excommunicated. And you see from earlier on, this patronage doesn't just end with the monarchy, also um, is also done in monasteries and churches that are pretty wealthy. Perhaps this is one of the few. This is one of the manuscripts which is not yet digitized. I recently came across it in the library 2 years ago. It's a beautiful psalter, again dated to the 14th, 15th century, and this psalter also contains quite a lot of marginalias, as well as a portrait of one King Solomon, which I'm not sure if it's the early king. And the other rich array of information that could be found in manuscripts are in the hagiography. If one pays, careful attention or reads the early hagiography, like Abuna Gabra Manfas Kedus's miracles, and also the miracles of Tekla Haymanot, what you get is you get a lot of geographical information, where the saint has journeyed. For example, he gives an accurate description of his monastery, Zukala. And there are, of course, also cultural, uh, descriptions in this hagiography. So my point is really to just highlight some of these rich resources that you find in these manuscripts. That, in my opinion, it's always overlooked by historians. Yes, we focus on the codicology aspect and philology aspect, but the text itself reveals a lot about what life was like in the Middle Ages. And then, of course, another brilliant example is this early example of the Act of Lalibela. He's actually named Gabra Mescal. Again, in this hagiography, which I consider to be history, we get quite a lot of stories of his men and how they all worked together to build his churches. And then the other important, again, aspect, which is again ignored, is the whole a commentary tradition. I'm using a 16th century example here. The commentary tradition comes out of the education, the school. So it doesn't just come out of all of this manuscript production. It doesn't come out of just a random monk sitting somewhere and translating. Rather, there are rules set. And when we look at the commentary, right, pretty earlier on, there were sets of standards, a theological discussion, which is evident in those commentary texts that we see. And of course, the Ethiopian education system, we're not sure as to whether it was the contemporary of the school of Edessa or after, but we do have oral stories of important church figures coming out of those church schools. One example is Saint Yared, who is, in fact, the you could say one could say the patron saint of students for his endeavor to finish his studies. So the commentary texts are really important example, and this one in particular, although it dates to the 16th century, we do get the sense that this commentary tradition was already important at that time. Another interesting uh, discovery that which is quite known, is from this 1512, 1528 manuscript, Mazmura Christos, the Psalter of Christ, written by Abba Bahari, who is also an historian who actually wrote Zenaula Galla, the history of the Oromos. And at the start of that manuscript, there is a very interesting list of some about 100 books that he mentions. And one can only assume these books have existed. So we get a bibliography of list of very interesting books. For example, Khalil Wal-Dimna, this is the animal fable, which was translated from I think the Sanskrit into Arabic. So we get a glimpse, not just a glimpse, but we get a great detail in their understanding and how they've worked. So the resources are not really consulted as much as I would, would like to. And of course, the other aspect is the physical, the book itself, the which has received great attention from quite a few scholars, including Bauzi and his colleagues. And yes, the physical aspect of the books that hasn't seemed to change, and it's there to be studied. So my conclusion is basically that there is a great deal of resources out there, but I don't think they've been considered that much, and hence we have a great gap in our understanding of what we call the Ethiopian Middle Ages. Thank you.